Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. We're releasing this episode on Labor Day weekend, a time when gardeners' thoughts turn to late summer and early fall garden chores. Perhaps you have or you want an organic garden. Then you'll want to hear what organic garden educator Steve Zion has to say about having the best cool season organic garden in your neighborhood. Of course, it's still late summer, and that includes ongoing control of warm weather pests, such as that ravenous caterpillar, the tomato worm. America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, has tips for controlling tomato hornworms, tomato fruit worms, and tomato pinworms. It's all right here in episode number 281, Cool Season Organic Garden Basics. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, and we're brought to you today by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Let's go. Well, it's the change of seasons, kind of, and you might be ripping out your summer vegetable garden. Goodbye, tomatoes, squash, and peppers. Hello, broccoli, cauliflower, peas, and whatever. But before you add your cool season vegetables to your garden, what about your soil? That would be what my guest would tell you. Steve Zion, podologist, soil expert. We've talked before with Steve, and one of the most popular episodes in the Garden Basics series has been where he's talked about feeding your soil. And Steve, as people change over to the seasons, to cool season, just like they would change into the spring season in March or April, this time of year, you gotta feed the soil, because taking out plants and putting in other plants, well, those new plants may be getting off to a weaker start unless you did something to the soil first.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to realize a lot of people when they're thinking about, putting things down for the soil, add to the soil for feeding the plants, what we really have to realize is that the soil is alive. A teaspoon of soil contains more microscopic organisms than there are people on Earth. And it's these organisms that nurture your plants. They provide water, nutrients, and even pest management. And if you've got clay soil, and I suspect a few of your listeners have clay soils, these are the organisms that create soil structure that will open up that clay soil so that water and air and nutrients and roots and everything can move through and function. And they actually glue the sand, silt, and clay particles together and create a diversity of pore spaces so that you have these large pore spaces where air will exist in the soil. Without those large pore spaces, you don't have any air, and people have a lot of problems with their soil. The goal of fertilizing and amending the soil is to create this healthy soil. You want to feed the living soil. We want to get away from the whole idea of feeding the plant. It's all about creating a favorable environment for the soil biology, because that's what takes care of your plant.
Now, most gardeners would think, okay, I'm taking out my summer vegetable garden. I know those plants used up a lot of nitrogen, so all I need to do is just add some nitrogen fertilizer and everything will be fine. In reality, if you did that, what would happen?
Not much, especially depending upon what kind of fertilizer you use. What you just talked about, actually, when I was in ag school 3,000 years ago, that's what we were taught. But they did not realize at that point that the soil was alive and we need to feed the soil. And one of the things that you have to realize is that the soil biology eat the most of is organic matter. And so you need to put in organic matter, and you do that not by tilling the soil. Tilling the soil destroys the soil structure and actually ends up compacting the soil and kills the soil biology. So you just want to put these things on the soil surface. The best two things that you can put down are worm castings Those are my favorite, especially if you've got clay soils, because they contain a lot of different kinds of soil biology. And compost. And you just put it on top of the soil. And then as you irrigate this time of year, because we still have to irrigate, and then later on in the season when we get rains, the rains and the irrigation will work that organic matter into the soil. Also, by putting that organic matter on the soil surface, worms will come up every single night and feed on that material and go back down in the morning. And they'll act as Mother Nature's rototillers. And so they're going to, that organic material, the compost and the worm castings will eventually disappear because it's going to be going into the soil, feeding the soil biology. And when you see that gone, time to add more.
What is missing from soil at the end of a growing season?
Nitrogen is certainly one of them, and so you do want to add some sort of nitrogen source. Ideally, what I like to try and recommend people do is do a soil test. Ideally, you send your soil off to a lab, and you get a full analysis, but that's more expensive and more complicated than a lot of people want to do. But you can go to your local nursery, and they have soil test kits that are relatively accurate enough for our purposes. And they will test the nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, and the pH. And then you will know whether you need to add more nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, and or adjust the pH of your soil.
Let's explain those terms before we go any further. I always thought our friend Giselle Schoninger of Kellogg Garden Products always put it best when explaining the roles of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. She would say,
"Yeah, I like her little poem."
I don't remember the poem, but for NPK, the three letters, it represents up, down, and all around.
That's the poem.
All right. Nitrogen gives you leafy green growth. The phosphorus improves the root structure of the plant.
Yes. Phosphorus is also, though, important in flower and fruit development.
Mm-hmm. And then the K, the potassium, is basically for all-around vigor and health.
Yeah, it helps all of the various functions of the plant operate properly.
And pH is this interesting concept. It's short for percent hydrogen, and it refers to the acidity or alkalinity of the soil, which I've tried to explain to people that for all those soil critters down there that are feeding your plants, these are the tunnels they run through to get to the plants, and the size of that tunnel for them to run through is determined by the pH of the soil.
Right. And the pH where that funnel is widest, where the plants can get the most nutrients available, that works for them, is when the pH is roughly somewhere in the vicinity of like 6.2 or 3, or maybe even 6.4, up to about 7,
which is
actually 6.8.
Slightly acid to neutral, basically.
Right. And the problem is with most of our soils in this area, because I've done lots of soil tests over the years.
This area being the United States of America?
No, in the Sacramento region.
Okay. All right. Most
of them. But they in the Sacramento region, most of them are above 7.0. Most of them are above 7.2. And so that's a little alkaline, and that does restrict some of the nutrients, in particular iron. A lot of people in springtime, their leaves, especially of their acid-loving plants, turn yellow. And so they will go to the local nursery and say, my gardenias or my blueberries, the leaves are turning yellow. And one of the issues is that the pH is just too high and the iron isn't available. In almost all of the soil tests that I've done, again, in this area, there's plenty of iron in the soil. It's just not available because the pH is too high. And so what I've been trying, I worked with an organization called Our Water, Our World, and we tried to educate the nursery folks on how to minimize the use of pesticides for their clients. And one of the things that people were having problems with is this yellowing of the acid-loving plants due to the high pH. And a lot of times people would just recommend iron. and the nursery folks would just recommend iron. Oh, your plants are deficient in iron. You need to add iron to your soil. And the fact of the matter is there's plenty of iron in the soil. And so what I tried to convince them to do is buy a pH. Don't sell them a pH test kit. Let them test the pH of their soil. And then they need to adjust the pH of their soil.
So what do you add to soil to bring down that pH number?
Some of the things, and some of these include soybean meal, which would add nitrogen. Fish hydrolysate, which is similar to fish emulsion. It's just manufactured a little different. You actually get more bang for your buck. Compost made with a lot of brown material, earthworm castings, and paper, cardboard, cellulose. You can, chop that up and just put it on the soil surface. Again, you're not mixing this stuff with in the soil. You're just putting it on top.
What you're describing could also be called mulch as well. So if you put a woody mulch on the surface of your soil year round, you're going to have a more balanced soil.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Well, I mean, the woody material, a lot of times people, get these wood chips, and I really like the wood chips because they have a diversity of particle size. And so the small particles break down and enter the soil very, very quickly and start nourishing the soil biology, which then starts nourishing your plants. And then the bigger pieces last a little longer and will provide the cooling effect in the summertime, the warming effect in the wintertime, and help conserve moisture in the soil as well.
And in fact, if you keep a 4-inch layer of a natural mulch like that, and that could be the chipped, shredded tree parts from your local arborist as well.
Right. Yeah.
By keeping that mulch on the soil, you are feeding the soil year round, which may mean you don't have to use as much fertilizer as you may be used to.
Exactly.
All right, but so we've lowered the pH. Now, for our friends listening where soils are naturally acidic, it's a low number, and they're always dealing with, okay, how do we raise the pH to get it more towards neutral? How do you raise the pH?
That's actually much easier. One thing that you can use is wood ash. Normally, for our soils, you don't want to add wood ash because, like I said, most of our soils, the pH is too high.
Right.
But you can also, if you're trying to raise the pH, you can use different forms of lime. Oyster shell lime and ground limestone work very, very well. There's also a material called dolomite lime. And in our area, I generally don't recommend that because in all the soil tests that I did, most of the soils have very high to excessive amounts of magnesium. And dolomite has not only lime, but it also has magnesium. And so it's adding more magnesium to a soil that probably has too much already. So you're better off with the oyster shell lime. And you can get that at any nursery. You can also use compost that has a lot of green materials, aged or compost manures, grass clippings, but make sure to don't put them down thick where they will mat up.
Dry them out first.
Pardon me?
Pardon you? Let them dry. let them dry out first.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, because it's the soil biology again that helps a lot in the raising of the pH or lowering the pH. It's the fungi and what you're trying to do when you're trying to lower the pH. You're trying to feed the fungi because they put out acid materials when they're doing their thing, and then the bacteria, the excretions from the bacteria will help to raise the pH, and so you're basically, by adding these various things, trying to get either more bacteria or more fungi active in your soil. And it's all about the soil biology.
Let's go back to adding ashes to the soil, which can make your soil more alkaline.
Right.
A couple of words of warning about that, especially if your soil is already near neutral or is already alkaline, is if you're going to add ash from the wood stove, you would only want to add, I believe, 1 pound per 100 square feet in order to bring it up gradually.
If your pH is I think before you add any wood ash, you need to test the pH, and you can go to your local nursery and they sell just pH test kits. They're very inexpensive. And I would say if your pH is 6.7 or above, don't use wood ash. It makes a great present for your gardening friends that live back east because they have acidic soil.
Mm-hmm. All right. But now having established that, what about ash from the barbecue?
Depending upon what they're using, if they're using, the briquettes, which most people do, I certainly would not use that.
Because there's other stuff in there you don't want to put in the soil.
In there, yeah. I use mesquite when I barbecue. And if my pH was such that the wood ash would be appropriate, which it is not, I would not mind using that. But because my pH is high enough, I don't want to raise it anymore. I dispose of the wood ash.
Basically, don't use charcoal briquette ash in your garden.
Definitely not.
All right. Question came in right up your alley and also pertinent to what we're talking about here. It's email from Kathy who says, I have a question about my fall planting boxes. Is it okay for them to be resting in an unwatered state? If the beds are empty, should you still be watering them?
That kind of depends. It's helpful to, keep the soil biology alive and active. What I would do is put down a mulch or, my favorite, worm castings or compost, and then, water occasionally. Keep that soil somewhat moist and active. And if you've got a raised bed or a box and you've got worms in there, those would probably die. Most of the soil biology would probably go dormant, but it would take them a little while to come back. So if it's just going to be for a couple of weeks or maybe a month, I would probably keep it moist.
And, of course, if you live in an area that gets summer rain, you don't have to pay attention to what we're saying. But if you live in an area where it never rains in the summertime or it's so seldom that people take a holiday when it happens, basically it needs to get moistened and fairly thoroughly moistened, too. I don't think a drip system in a raised bed turned on is going to thoroughly saturate the soil. I think you'd be better off setting up a sprinkler inside of it and thoroughly saturating the soil that way. And if it's been dry for any length of time, at least a week or so before you plant your cool season crops, man, oh man, put that sprinkler on and let it water.
Yeah.
And make sure that water has penetrated the full depth of the bed, or at least 8 to 12 inches.
Yeah, I personally, I think if you've got your drip system set up properly, the drip system will work just fine. It's just you've got to make sure to leave it on long enough so that water, penetrates throughout that entire box.
It depends, as you would know, on the consistency of the soil. If it's a really loose, friable potting mix straight out of the bag that's in your raised beds, there's very little cross motion in that soil. And if you have drip emitters, it's going to be a very narrow cylinder that descends into the soil. Whereas in a garden bed that's comprised of sand, silt, and clay, that footprint of water from each emitter is going to be probably twice as wide as what it would be in a raised bed.
Yeah. What you want to do whenever you irrigate. It's the only way in my opinion, to know how to irrigate. When to irrigate, how much to irrigate, which is basically how long, and whether, if you're using a drip system, whether you're getting good coverage, and that's to dig into your soil. And in your garden and landscape where you're dealing with soil, I think a soil probe is probably the better tool to utilize in a raised bed. They've got what's called a soil sleuth. Both of them are available online. The soil, and basically what you do is you push these things in the ground, you pull them out, and there will be soil in these tools, and you will actually be able to look at them and feel them to find out whether they are moist. And by shoving them in various places after you're done irrigating, you will be able to see whether you're getting good coverage, like we were just talking about, throughout that raised bed. And if not, then you're going to want to, apply it over the top, like you were saying.
The soil sleuth, do that again, Fred.
Sleuth.
Thank you. The soil sleuth is an interesting contraption. It is so simple to look at. It is ingenious in its design. It looks like a red candy cane. It's got notches. Yeah. It's got notches along the inside of the long arm. And basically you just plunge that candy cane into the ground, give it a quarter turn, lift it out, and there are little pockets of soil on each of those notches that you can feel.
Yeah, it's very, very cool, and it works really, really well in loose soil. If you're putting it into clay garden soil, you'll break it.
And Soil Sleuth, if you want to send me some money, I wouldn't mind.
I use both. I use both the Soil Sleuth and the Soil Probe.
Okay, explain how the Soil Probe works.
Soil Probe basically is a tube, and a portion of the side of it is like an open window. And you push that into the ground, you give it a little twist and pull it out, and you will see, the whole thing will be, the whole column of soil will be there, and you will be able to see whether the soil is moist at various depths as far down as you pushed it in. And so what I generally tell people is you use the Soil Probe to make sure before you irrigate that the soil is dry enough where it merits irrigation, because one of the biggest problems people have in areas where you have to irrigate a lot in the summertime because they don't get rain is they irrigate too frequently, and so the soil stays too wet, especially in like the Sacramento area where we get hot, sunny days. The surface of the soil, if you water in the morning, by the time you get home from work, that surface soil, if you don't have a mulch on, will be bone dry, and people always think, oh, I need to irrigate again. But if you were to use your Soil Probe, you would find that when you go down 1/8 of an inch, and that soil is probably moist, if not wet. And so it will, by putting it in the ground and pulling it out, it will indicate when the soil is dry enough to merit irrigation. Then how much irrigation do you need? I tell people typically water half as long as you normally do. Wait an hour, give gravity the chance to pull it down as far as it's going to go. Push the Soil Probe in the ground again, pull it out, and you will see how far down that water has penetrated. And if it's gone down 4 inches and the roots of your plants are going down 8 inches, you've got to double the amount of water. It does require a little bit of math.
We've learned a lot again from Steve Zion, podologist, soil expert. Steve, thanks for your time.
You're welcome. It's been fun.
I'm pretty picky about who I allow to advertise on this podcast. My criteria, though, is pretty simple. It has to be a product I like, a product I use, and a product I would buy again. And you know who checks all those boxes? It's Smart Pots. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Smart Pots are sold around the world, and they're proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots come in a wide array of sizes and colors and can be reused year after year. Some models even have handles, and that makes them a lot easier to move around the yard. Because the fabric breathes, Smart Pots are better suited than plastic pots, especially for hot climates. That breathable fabric has other benefits too. Water drainage issues? Not with Smart Pots. Roots that go round and round choking the root ball like they do in plastic pots? Doesn't happen with Smart Pots. These benefits will help you get a bigger, better plant than what you've gotten in the past with the same size plastic or other hard container. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers as well as select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED, F-R-E-D. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. What does driving an old British sports car, dating a Kardashian, or growing dogwood trees have in common? Well, they are all beautiful and fun, but they're high maintenance. In the latest issue of the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter, we try to lower the maintenance needs of your dogwood trees. A dogwood tree. It's easy to love. It has flowers in the spring, beautiful orange or pink or red fall leaf color, and it's just the right size for suburban purgatory. A small to medium height tree, perfect for a patio area. But the dogwood tree does have issues, and it has needs. If you're already a Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter subscriber, it's probably in your email waiting for you right now. Or you can start a subscription. It's free. Learn how to reduce stress on dogwood trees. Find the link to the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast in today's show notes or on the Substack app. Or you can sign up at the newsletter link at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. This time of year, we get a lot of questions about tomatoes, including one of our favorites, which is, who's eating my tomato plants? Debbie Flower is here, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor. And usually when it comes down to strangers munching on tomatoes, it's something in the worm family.
Right.
But it's not really a worm. It's a caterpillar.
Yes, it's the larva of a butterfly or a moth. And
there's more than one critter doing this. A lot of us think of the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm. And the difference between those two is just the number of stripes on their back.
Oh, okay.
One has 7 and one has 8.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Well, now all I got to do is remember which ones has 7 and which ones have 8. If I recall correctly, the tomato hornworm has 7 white horizontal stripes on its back, and the tobacco hornworm has 8. Well, I should know better than try to remember something off the top of my head. According to the North Carolina State University, larval tobacco hornworms have 7 diagonal stripes on each side and a red posterior horn, while larval tomato hornworms have 8 chevrons on each side and a bluish-black horn. Everything you've ever wanted to know about tomato hornworms. But they basically are doing the same thing. They're eating and pooping.
They're very noticeable because they're big. They're green, or some can lean toward the brown color. They're the color of what they eat. And so in that sense, they disappear among the plant. So what you typically see is an area of the plant that is missing its leaves. Or the other thing you see is a collection of black poop that has... If you see it, look up the plant from there because poop falls down. And the bigger the poop, the bigger the tomato hornworm. And they can get up to 4 inches long.
They start off small, though, and finding them when they're small is not easy. That's why it's always nice to have birds around.
Yes. Birds like to eat them. I got in the habit at my last garden of checking the leaves of my tomatoes right around the 4th of July. So this is for my climate, when I would have planted the tomatoes mid to late April as young plants, small plants. May, June, 2.5 months later, I'm looking at underneath the leaves for little white eggs. They're just on the edge of the leaf, but on the underside. And then I squash them. Those are the eggs of the tomato hornworm.
Are they laid singly?
They're laid singly, yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
And the moth that laid that egg is certainly an interesting variety. Some people call it the sphinx moth or a hummingbird moth. It's sort of a big, nondescript brown moth that if you like aromatic plants and you've planted Nicotiana, that's its favorite plant. So you may not want, if you like tomatoes and you have an aromatic garden somewhere, you might want to keep Nicotiana out of it.
Right. I know people who will not kill the tomato hornworm because they love that moth, which flies at night. So if you don't spend time in your garden at night, you may never see it.
The only way you're going to catch that moth is when you see it emerging from the soil in spring.
I have never seen that.
I have.
Have you?
It was like a gift from God.
I bet.
I was preparing a raised bed to plant tomatoes, and I was working. This is the old days. I was double digging.
Oh, yes. We don't do that anymore.
Yes. And double digging is a lot of work.
It is.
Well, as I was double digging, all of a sudden I saw the ground start vibrating.
Oh, wow.
And then this moth appeared. I mean, it was kind of wet looking and small, but you could see it was trying to open its wings there on the surface. Oh my, it is the sphinx moth. Wow. And it had that red football-like cocoon sort of semi-attached to it that it was trying to break free from.
Those I have seen.
Yeah.
They're kind of mahogany color and shiny and have a pointed end.
Yeah, they look like a football. And if you see them, throw them like a football to the birds. But I saw this moth starting to start its life.
Oh.
And I go, it's a miracle of life. And I stomped it with my shoe.
Oh.
I'm sorry, but I like my tomatoes more.
Yeah. Well, they are, the larvae of moths and butterflies are the teenage eating machine phase of their life. They have an egg that hatches into this larva. It's very small at first and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it eats and eats and eats. And then it pupates, gets into that football case. In some cases, other cocoons or chrysalises look different, but they themselves all covered up and go into a resting stage, often in the soil. And then
often near the plant.
And often near the plant, right?
Yeah.
Right. They just sort of drop to the ground and pupate, it's called, create this case around them and spend a resting period there, living off of the food that they have eaten as the larval stage. And then they convert, which to me is like a miracle. They convert from this wormy caterpillar into something that flies.
It is amazing, but they're not your best friend.
No.
If you like tomatoes. And it's not uncommon if you are tearing out your tomato plants at the end of the season, you just might dig up some of these brownish, orangish, football-looking cocoons. And like I say, that's bird food.
Yes, it is. Birds do like it. Yes.
Yeah. That's the life cycle of the tomato hornworm. But there's a couple of other tomato worms that also are involved in eating, and their eating habits are a little different because the hornworm will munch on leaves, it'll munch on fruit. It's pretty indiscriminate as far as what it's going to be enjoying on that tomato plant. But then you've got like the fruit worm and the pinworm.
Right.
And what sort of damage do they do?
Well, the fruit worm, it's also called a corn earworm, and these insects have limited host ranges, meaning that they won't eat just anything. The tomato hornworm eats tomatoes. The tobacco hornworm eats tobacco. The tomato fruitworm has a little bit larger host range. They'll eat tomatoes, lettuce, corn, and a few other edibles. It occurs later in the growing season. So the tomato hornworm where we live starts its eggs from eggs in early July. We're looking at more like August for the tomato fruitworm to appear. And it is the adult will come in and lay eggs on the leaves again, and they're typically on the underside. That's a protective thing that insects do. So you got to look at the backside. They are translucent and they are white, but then within like 24 hours, they go through a yellow and brown stage. So that's one way you could tell it from a hornworm if you're looking. The larvae hatch and they start eating, and they will eat pretty much anything, leaves, buds, and fruit. Again, they will produce the poop. So look up if you see the poop to find the offender, and they will leave holes in the leaves and holes in the fruit. Then they fall to the ground and pupate in the soil as well. So in both cases, hand picking is one thing to do. And if you can't stand to touch the caterpillar, they will try to hold on. It's amazing how much strength they have in their little legs. You can just take the leaf or the fruit with it and drop it in some soapy water. Having birds around, so having stakes in the garden that the birds will sit on. They can just be sticks, a piece of fencing, the cage around your tomato might be enough for them. And they will find them and take them away for you. But the other is to create the good bug hotel, as Fred likes to talk about. And he has a list of the plants that you would want in your good bug hotel at Farmer Fred. Plants that attract beneficials. Growing some of those around the garden will help bring in the natural enemies of these insects, which are typically very small, tiny, tiny wasps that will attack them.
We'll have a link to that site in today's show notes. You can find it at farmerfred.com. There's two stories about it, one called The Good Bug Hotel and the other that is called Plants That Attract Beneficial Insects.
And the other way to control these is with a chemical called BT. It's a live organism, Bacillus thuringiensis. So you want to buy it fresh and store it indoors, not in your garage where it gets to be 150 degrees maybe.
Yes.
And you mix it with water and you apply it. The thing is that you have to apply it at the right time. So with the tomato hornworm, it has to be applied as the eggs are hatching or you have the small larva. So for me here, that's the first week of July. For the tomato fruitworm, it only works when the fruitworm is coming out of the egg when it's its absolute very smallest. So you can use it. It's very specific to the larvae of butterflies and moths, but only the ones that eat it. So if you put it on your tomatoes, it's not going to harm monarch butterflies because they have nothing to do with tomatoes. They don't eat tomatoes. It's not going to harm swallowtails that are beautiful and we love to watch because they don't eat tomatoes either. So if you only apply it to tomatoes, it will only affect the larvae that eat tomato leaves. And so that's the tomato hornworm and the tomato fruitworm.
We'll have links to both the fruitworm, the pinworm, and the hornworm in today's show notes so you can see how different they look.
Yes, they do look different.
And one strategy, too, and we talk about doing this for a variety of reasons, and pest control is one of those reasons, and that's rotate your crops. Mm-hmm. Don't plant tomatoes in the same spot year after year.
And this is a big reason for that.
Yeah.
So you can, as you said, you saw the hornworm because you were working in the soil. And if I have done that, I have not seen it emerge, but I have seen the case, the chrysalis, the pupal case. And yeah, if you can dig those out, that helps.
Yeah, that's one way to control it. But again,
you got to get them all.
Yeah. And the problem, too, with planting the same crop in the same place year after year is you're creating a incubation zone for diseases.
Yes.
That will attack
that is
the same plants.
Mm-hmm.
So rotate your crops.
And then there's the pinworm. The pinworm is quite different. We're coming down in size. We started at the hornworm that can be like 4 inches long. And then we have the fruitworm, which is maybe half that size. Yeah. And now we're down to the pinworm, which is really small, like maybe 1/4 of an inch. And it's thin. Its host range is a lot of the things in the Solanaceae family, which includes tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and there are some weeds, or things we call weeds, that are in that family as well. And it goes after the fruit of those.
And that would be something that you'd want to remove.
Yes. Yes. It attacks the fruit itself. In potatoes, we might think that the potatoes we eat are the fruit, but that's not the case. Fruit have seed in them, and potatoes, if you let it form, will produce a fruit above ground. They will have a flower, it'll get pollinated, and they will produce a fruit. And that is where you're going to find the pinworm. So it's very small, it's light colored. It can be actually a whole variety of colors, tan, gray, and in some references talk about it being dark. So you're looking for a small, very small, thin worm. And it's going to be on the fruit. And these have the ability to produce silk. It can spin a web. It can spin a protective covering over itself that is white and looks thready. And that when it starts to eat, that's what it will do. And then as more of them appear, they will tie leaves together as protection.
Then again, if you start seeing some curled leaves, that might be the reason they're curling, is there's somebody curled up in there.
Open them up and see if there's somebody in there and squash them if there is. Right. Then they eat some leaves and they find their way to the fruit and they make a small hole, like a pinhole, near the stem end of the fruit. And they get in there and then, they're well protected in there and they eat all they want of your fruit.
So this is in like a lot of situations where if you see holes in a piece of a fruit, that is the exit point for a borer of some sort. Mm-hmm. Whereas a tomato with a hole, there still may be somebody in there.
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be excitement.
Yeah, yum. They're very difficult to control because they're so well protected all the time. And so you're going to want to rotate your crops, as Fred said. You want to, if you bring in transplants, you bought them or your friend grew them or whatever, check them over for eggs. These tomato worms lay eggs on the backs of leaves. In this case, they're white and they turn yellow and then orange. And there may be single or they may be 2 or 3 together. So any eggs you see on the back of a tomato leaf, examine it, look it over, turn those leaves over. You can just run your fingers over the margins and squash anything that you do find. So remove them before you bring them in.
They're prolific. I mean, if they develop 7 to 8 generations a year,
right? They're busy and they overlap. The generations overlap. So yes, 7 to 8 generations a year. There are a lot of them. If you've got them, it's a problem. So you're going to have to eliminate the plant as soon as you find the worm on it, because they could be in other parts of the plant and laying eggs could be all over those plants.
Well, I would wait until you see more. Would you? If you saw one worm, would you rip out the plant?
If I saw one, no, but I would spend a lot of time examining the plant and any other plants that were nearby.
What's nice for gardeners is you have another helper. You may not think of them as helpers, but they're helpers when it comes to control, especially tomato hornworms. And that's our friends, the wasps. Mm-hmm. Paper wasps and yellow jackets. Mm-hmm. They like tomato worms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they do. I watched them once on a hike in Castle Crags Park. It was not a tomato hornworm, but it was a caterpillar of a butterfly or moth, and they wrestled it off the plant, put it on the ground, and then cut it in pieces and flew off a piece at a time. And came back and got the next piece and took it away. But they basically, they didn't have a saw. They used their mouth parts, chewed it into pieces. It was really cool.
Yeah, and I've seen them do that to tomato hornworms, and they were just biting off chunks and flying away.
Woo!
Yes.
So, they got family to feed.
Yeah, so don't panic if you start seeing paper wasp or yellow jackets flitting about your tomato plants.
Right.
They're just trying to help.
And when they're not there, you may want to go see what they're after.
I'd like to know where they live.
Yes.
Yes. But,
well, you don't want them living near your door or whatever.
No.
The other thing they go after is honeydew. And so they can be an indication that there is a sucking insect, aphids or scale in your garden would be likely contenders producing the stickiness that they actually eat.
But unlike aphids or scale, you can't use a blast of water from a hose to end your tomato.
No, they are tenacious. I don't know what they have on the ends of their feet, but you can't knock them off with water.
They'd appreciate the shower.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So tomato worms, generally, if you control the problem and you control their reproductive schedule, you can keep them under control and keep the birds around, too.
Keep the birds and the good bugs.
Yeah. They help out a lot.
They sure do.
As you pointed out, the only known effective chemical is BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, but that, again, works best on the smaller worms, the bigger worms.
When they're new out of the egg, yes. And so you have to kind of know when they show up.
And they have to be hit directly, don't they?
They have to eat it.
Oh, okay.
So you can do the top of the leaf and they'll come around and eat that leaf and it'll cause them tummy problems.
Tomato worms.
Hope you don't have them.
Thank you, Debbie.
You're welcome, Fred.
Are you thinking of growing fruit trees? Maybe you already are, but you'll want to know more about them. Well, you probably have a million questions, like which fruit trees will grow where I live? What are the tastiest fruits? When's harvest time? How do I care for these trees? The good news is the answers are all nearby. Just go to davewilson.com, click on the Home Garden tab at the top of the page. And in that Home Garden tab, you're going to find a link to their fruit and nut harvest chart so you can be picking delicious, healthy fruits from your own yard for a long growing season. Here in USDA Zone 9, that could be May through December. And you're just a click away with the informative YouTube video series at davewilson.com. As part of that video series, they'll walk you through the simple process of using the Dave Wilson website to find their trees either at a nearby local nursery or at a mail order source. That's Dave Wilson Nursery, the nation's largest grower of fruit trees for the backyard garden. They've got planting tips, taste test results, and information about their revolutionary backyard orchard culture techniques. That'll explain how you can have a cornucopia of different fruit trees in a small backyard. Your harvest to better health begins at davewilson.com. As summer transitions into fall, this is a great time of the year for rehabbing your garden soil. But what should you add to your soil? Or not add to your soil? America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, has those answers. And have you ever wondered if you could grow tomatoes in the fall and winter? Well, yeah, you can, especially if you have a greenhouse. But there are varieties of tomatoes that will do much better in the time of the year that have cooler temperatures and less sunlight. We have that list. It's no wonder that episode 233 from last September is one of the most listened to podcasts in the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred series, Soil Questions and Growing Winter Tomatoes. So give it a listen. Go back into the catalog. It's episode number 233, Soil Questions and How to Grow Tomatoes in the Fall and Winter. Find a link to it in today's show notes or at the podcast player of your choice. And you can find it at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast comes out once a week on Fridays. Plus, the newsletter podcast that comes with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter continues, and that will also be released on Fridays. Both are free, and they're brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. The Garden Basics podcast is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes our homepage, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you can also sign up for the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. That's gardenbasics.net, or you can use the links in today's show notes. And thank you so much for listening.